Madam Mayor. Yes, we
Again, supporting us. You're a great support, and I appreciate it. Okay. All right, so we are going to start. I'm opening the meeting up, and we're going to, obviously, this is a special town council. It's a special meeting of the council, committee of the whole, and we're going to start with the Pledge of Allegiance. If you can stand, please do. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And now we will go to roll call. Ms. LeBron?
Ms. Blanks? Ms. Cantor?
Here.
Mr. Davidoff?
Here.
Ms. Fay?
Present.
Mr. Gold?
Here.
Ms. Kerrigan? Mr. Sweeney?
Here.
Mr. Winograd, happy birthday.
Thank you. Here.
Mr. Williams?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. LeBron. I just want to go through the protocol. So this is a special meeting, as I said, not a special meeting, but that's a committee of the whole, sorry. And this is in accordance with Governor Lamont's executive orders 7B and 7I. And we obviously can meet virtually, and we do project this meeting for everyone to view. I'm sorry, there's a little background noise, so we'll go through the meeting. This is not for public comment. This is for the council members to receive information from staff and the council to engage in questions and discussion on items. So this is a little bit unique, and we were trying to streamline and cover several committees together, and we thought this was a great way to do that. We are actually changing the order. We're not voting on anything. This is informational only, but we have several business items that the staff would like to cover with us, and information that we updates on certain information. So we're actually, on the town manager's request, going to start with 2B, which is our the drainage system evaluation. Mr. Hart.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, everyone. Matt Hart, Town Manager. I'm sorry, Mayor, I'm just finishing a text to one of our council members. I just sent that. So thank you. Here to lead our discussion on this item tonight from town staff, we have our town engineer, Dwayne Martin. We also have Julie Vieira, one of our project engineers, our drainage specialist. We also have our consulting team from CDM Smith, and we have Cindy Bauman and Joe La Liberté. And CDM Smith has worked with the town in the past. Why did we conduct this study? Veteran council members are well aware that stormwater has been something of a concern in town, particularly in recent years. You know, flooding seems to be becoming more pronounced in certain areas of town. You know, there are various reasons for that, whether it's climate change, more intense storms, more impervious surface, probably a combination of all those factors. But we wanted to look at our stormwater system to, number one, evaluate it, and then number two, see how it could be improved to address this condition. So we have a presentation that Dwayne and CDM Smith will conduct for you this evening. We do want your questions. We have some recommended next steps, and there are some neighborhoods in town that are acutely interested in this study, and we will be conducting public information sessions for them next month. But we wanted to lead off and to provide you with an update. And again, we thank you for the funding you allocated in our capital plan to conduct phase 1 of this study, as well as phase 2 that we will be beginning soon. So through you, Mayor, I would like to now turn to Mr. Martin.
Thank you. Just remember to state your name and your title so people can follow. Mr. Martin?
Sure, thank you. It's Dwayne Martin. I'm the West Hartford Town Engineer. Thank you for allowing me to give an intro to this presentation. Madam Mayor and members of the Town Council. Just to take a step back, Matt did a good job of explaining, but I wanted to add on a couple things. Technically, there's 3 drainage studies that are either completed or in process. So we're going to go over in detail the second one. But to back up, the first one that was completed was in the former Yukon parcel or site area. There's been some known flooding issues in Trout Brook in that area. In particular, just to mention a couple streets, Lindy Lane and Haynes Road. Long-standing drainage and flooding issues in that neighborhood. When the Yukon parcel was discussed for redevelopment, I shared some concerns for that neighborhood and potentially the development that there may be some concerns. And so we conducted a drainage study to see what could be done to reduce or eliminate flooding in that area. So that's the first one. There'll be a minor mention of that later on. And then CDM Smith is going to present tonight on the completed study that they did in 3 large watershed areas in the central area of town. That started from what I was referring to as the FEAT area, F-E-A-T, which is an acronym I came up with for the bounding limits within that original study, which are Fern Street, which ended up turning into Farnham Road. Farnham Road is challenged with repetitive flooding. So that's the F. E meaning Elizabeth Park. Walbridge Road in particular has longstanding flooding issues. Asylum Ave, there's Middlebrook Road as an example, and then Trout Brook Drive. So that's the FEAT neighborhood, which is comprised of the first study that you'll hear about. And the first study also contains portions of the Montclair Lynbrook neighborhood, which you're well aware of had some issues with drainage as well as the MDC project. So technically there's been 2 studies completed. The second one you're going to hear a lot about tonight. And then the third one is ongoing, also being conducted by CDM Smith. Once that's completed, we'll be back to give you information on that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Cindy and Joe from CDM Smith. They have a PowerPoint presentation to show you. They're estimating that should go about 20 minutes. There is some technical nature to the presentation. They said they would welcome questions if you wanted to, just to make sure that you understand as we go along. However, they prefer to wait to the end if you're okay with that. But either way is fine with them. And so without further ado, I believe Joe Liberty from CDM Smith is going to start off. So thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. I don't know if Joe's on mute. I don't know. But you are ready to go, Joe.
Great. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Dwayne. I'm actually going to turn it over to Cindy Baumann, who is the project manager.
Okay. Yeah, so my name is Cindy Baumann. I'm the project manager of this drainage study that we
How
did.
about now?
What? Can you hear me? You can't hear me.
Yeah,
We
no,
can hear you, Cindy. You're good.
You can? Okay.
Yep, thank you. We can hear you. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. Okay. So I have a little agenda first. We are going to, my technology is not working. There we go. So I'm going to go with an overview of the project, and then I'll go over some existing conditions with respect to the drainage. And then we came up with recommendations within the 3 areas that we're currently studying as part of phase 1 of this drainage study. And then we will go over costs, and then we've looked into some funding options as well. And then at the end, we do have some next steps for this study. So to start with the project overview, the project area consists of 6 subwatersheds, and that is shown in the graphic on the right. And there was significant flooding within these 6 areas over the past several years. And the most significant storm events occurred in April and September of 2018, and then there was one in August of 2019. We did have our first public meeting in June of 2019. And then we completed the phase 1 study, which includes areas 1, 2, and 3. We are currently doing phase 2 as well, which is areas 4, 5, and 6. The second public meeting, actually it's going to be 2 meetings, will be held in November for the phase 1, and then we're currently working on phase 2. And I am going to just jump for a minute to kind of zoom into this into I'm going to share the, so I have a blow up of this figure, and I hope you can, I think you're seeing it now, yes. So area 1 here is shown, and it does, it's bounded by Asylum Ave in the north and Farmington Ave in the south, and this is what Dwayne had referred to as the feet area. And it has a large drainage system that pretty much follows a lot of these arrows, like down Foxcroft and then down Middlebrook and discharges to Trout Brook. And then there's one other smaller system in area 1. Area 2 consists of this paler yellow color, and it is bounded by the south again as Farmington Ave. The west side is bounded by Trout Brook and Trout Brook Drive, and then it encompasses the main trunk lines, or the main drainage systems are down Fern and Milton Street. And the third area is this area. It's a long, thin area. It includes Loomis Drive, and then it includes the area on both sides of Trout Brook. Trout Brook goes between Mount Clair and Clifford Drive in this area. And area 3 includes the area south of Trout Brook there, as well as the area north of Trout Brook. And then I'll just briefly go over areas 4, 5, and 6. So 4 is kind of has 2 areas that both drain to Trout Brook. Trout Brook is right here, crosses North Main Street. And there's a southern area that, once again, Farmington Ave to the south. And it does include a large drainage system that comes from Brace Road and then down Brunswick, kind of goes cross country a little, then down North Main Street and discharges to Trout Brook. And then the northern part has another drainage system, a little smaller, but it predominantly comes down North Main Street and discharges to Trout Brook. Then there's area 5, which is tributary to St. Joseph's Tributary. So this blue line is St. Joseph's Tributary. And that area is pretty much bounded by Mohawk Drive in the north. And it does have large system and then 2 smaller systems, but the largest system, comes down a lot of these roadways the way the arrows are shown, and discharges right here to the mouth of St. Joseph's Tributary. And then last area, area 6, is bounded by Albany Ave, and it has several systems that discharge to Trout Brook. Trout Brook currently goes under Lindy Lane and is culverted under Haynes and Lawler, and then it's open through here. And then it connects with St. Joseph's and then follows on the west side of Trout Brook Drive. So there are a lot of little systems within Area 6 that discharge directly to the brook. So now I'm going to go back and share the presentation again. That's the only time I'm going to deviate from the presentation, but I thought it was good to kind of show you guys where the different areas are. So that is our entire area, with the phase 1 being areas 1, 2, and 3, and phase 2 being areas 4, 5, and 6. And so we're going to go into area 1, 2, and 3 now. And the project scope included collection and review of data. And then to fill the data gaps, we did some survey and field work. And then using that information there's 21 drainage systems in this area. In areas 1, 2, and 3, we did stormwater system modeling of those systems. And then we looked at alternatives for those systems that had deficiencies. And then we made recommendations. And then there's just some statistics on the bottom with respect to areas 1, 2, and areas 3. So now I'm going to go over the existing conditions. So we did create a model after performing the supplemental survey. The figure to your right has the drainage system that was modeled. So the yellow lines are the reaches or the pipes, and then the nodes are the blue lines, and then each of the red triangles are the outfalls that discharge to Trout Brook or the easterly branch of Trout Brook. And as I stated before, there were 21 systems that we modeled. The feet system, which Dwayne had mentioned at the very beginning, it was the largest of the systems, but the one down Milton and also down Fern were pretty large as well. We conducted calibration of those models and validated that the hydraulics within those drainage systems were modeling what we see today. We were fortunate to get flooding locations from the engineering, and I believe some came from fire as well, of specific locations during specific storms that where flooding had occurred, and we were able to calibrate the model based on that existing information that was provided when we ran those specific storms. We also then modeled a 10-year design storm, which is a storm that has a 10% chance of occurring in any given year. And that is industry standard for design of a drainage system. So then we actually did a metering program as well, because the feet area, so the large area that discharges to Trout Brook and comes, it starts up, well, the figure shows it to the right. It's predominantly the entire area 1 area. And it's a very large system that we ended up metering at 5 locations. So the red dots are where we installed meters, and we were actually able to capture 3 storm events. So we were actually able to calibrate our model based on 3 storms that had occurred during the project duration. And that gave us confidence in the representation of this model, and it also coincided, the metering results helped us to have a model that also coincided with the flooding locations that were provided by engineering. So then of the 21 systems, they're all shown on this table. We modeled the storms that are shown at the top, the 10-year design storm, as I had said, also Tropical Storm Lee, the 2018 storms, and then August 2019 storms. And we had flooding locations for all of the 3 storms that were modeled. So the Tropical Storm Lee, and then 2018 and the 2019 storms. And we were able to then show which of the 21 systems did not have capacity for those 3 storm events, the local historical storm events, as well as the design storm. And so these check marks show you which of the 21 systems were deficient for the different modeled storms that were run. And this will come into effect later, and you can notice that the ones that were had deficiencies or insufficient capacity for all 4 modeled storm events, when we get to later slides where we're actually ranking and prioritizing, this information was used to do a lot of the prioritization. So now I'm going to move on to just another item that was incorporated. There's 2 other items that were incorporated in this study, not only the evaluation of the capacity of the drainage system, but also the study that was done with respect to private inflow removal. So this map shows the total buildings. There's 1,747 buildings that have been identified, or there's total that were evaluated, but there's 661 that have been identified as requiring private removal of the private inflow. So it is where there's a sump pump that is connected to the sewer system, and it should be connected to the drainage system. And so all the red houses, as part of an MDC project, CDM Smith has gone into these houses and identified that the sump pumps should be disconnected so that we don't have inflow from those buildings into the sewer system. And so this does show that 38% of the buildings within areas 1, 2, and 3 need to be removed from the sewer system and put into the drainage system. And then just to note that there are some buildings that we did not inspect and did not gain access, so that there could be more buildings than shown on this current graphic that would need to be removed with respect to private inflow. And a little bit now for what you do for the private inflow buildings. So this graphic is just showing you what CDM Smith has done for MDC on the Greenhurst Road project, and it's a blow up of an area at the intersection of Westbrook Road and Greenhurst Road. And the blue lines are the existing drains, and then there's proposed drains that are shown, which are like the 12-inch and 18-inch. They were existing catch basins and drainage pipes that are new pipes. But then we are proposing, in this situation, it's the same as what we are proposing for the 3 areas that we are studying, is drainage extensions where drain lines needed to be extended because they are not currently down that roadway. And then also collector drains, which are small 6-inch pipes that would run adjacent to the right-of-way to provide a location for the disconnects to connect into the drainage system. And so these red lines that are thinner are the 6-inch collector drains that then take the drain services from each of the buildings that have been identified and provide them with a connection point so that they can then be connected to the drainage system. So it's kind of just a little education, because we are going to talk about collector drains in addition to the drainage system improvements. So next thing we also did was a groundwater assessment, and I do have 2 videos that were provided by residents within, this is predominantly within area 3 that we have a groundwater issue. And so I'm going to play the videos. So this one just shows backyard flooding that's as a result of groundwater. And you will see they're zooming around, but when you get to the end, you will actually see water that's bubbling up out of the ground. Yeah, so they will pan to the left and you'll see the water bubbling out of the ground. So right near this tree. Right here. Right there. And the groundwater is actually bubbling up into this backyard at this time. And then this other video, it's pretty quick, but this is actually water that's bubbling right out of, oh, sorry guys, I thought it would. There we go. There we go. It's actually bubbling right out of their foundation. So those were provided as part of the public meeting that we had June of 2019 to start off this project. And so we did, as part of the comments we got back as part of that public meeting, we also did a screening level groundwater model. And so we simulated groundwater based on some existing monitoring wells that are out there that were that we found information on, and the green line shows where the depth to groundwater is within 5 feet of the surface, and then the purple line is within 10 feet. And this is Mount Clair Drive. We're in area 3 here. This is Mount Clair and Lynbrook and Clifford, to give you some orientation. And then we can also, I will zoom in, and it does show, so this is the green line where it's stating that all these houses on Mount Clair Drive, and also those on Clifford and Fox Meadow, they have groundwater within 5 feet of the ground surface. And with most homes that have an 8-foot basement, that means the bottom of their basement is below groundwater. And even in this area near this area where the purple line is, that's groundwater within 10 feet. So this study did show that this area where the photos were, the video that was just provided, this area does have a groundwater issue. The groundwater is high. And so we are making recommendations when we get to the recommendations section on groundwater study as well. So I will move on to recommendations now. So we are making recommendations with respect to the drainage system and then the collector drains. And so this, I just blew up a little area to show you where the blue lines are existing pipes and the green lines show you both an existing pipe size, for example, on Lindbrook is a 12-inch, but the proposed size is in green, which is the 18-inch. So what we did for all, well, not all 21, it's only 13 that had deficiencies. So for 13 of the 21 drainage systems, we provided figures that show the existing and the proposed pipe sizes in order to accommodate that 10-year design storm. And so with the recommendations, we did some prioritization, and we have three prioritizations. We have a tier 1, which is the high priority. And this area is ones that had, or outfalls and drainage systems that had documented and modeled flooding. So they had 4 boxes across in that previous table that I showed you. So they had deficiencies for the 10-year storm as well as Tropical Storm Lee, as well as the 2018 and the 2019 flooding. And then there was a tier 2, which has modeled flooding for the 10-year and the historical events. But then tier 3 is the ones that only had them for the 10-year. So tier 3 are the ones that had a check mark only in the 10-year box, not for the historical flooding. And so I do have a table now that shows, so these are the 13 that had deficiencies that were modeled for those 4 different storm events. And I color coded them with red being the tier 1, and then green being the tier 2, and then the black is the tier 3. And so it does show you those that had more significant deficiencies and those that just had moderate deficiencies, and then the black are the ones that just were deficient for the 10-year storm, not for the historical storm events. So the next recommendations are with respect to the collector drains. So for within all of the areas, all 3 phase 1 areas, we took a look at the information that was provided for the MDC study, which are the greenhouses on this figure, where those are the buildings that need to be disconnected from the sewer and tied into the drain. And you can see on this one, for example, on Linwood Drive, that we have actually a drain extension, which are the solid lines, because that road does not currently have any drainage on it. And then to tie in the green buildings, we have the little collector drains, which are the 6-inch PVC pipes that the specific houses will tie into, which will then tie into a structure, whether it's a catch basin or a manhole. And this just provides a list of all the quantities for the different areas. So the buildings, the length of extensions, and the lengths of the collector drains. It is important to note that for the collector drainage system, that MDC coordination is required. So, because MDC is the one who's doing the disconnect program for the inflow, and they would be assisting with connecting those particular properties with the new drainage extensions. And then the recommendation for the groundwater study is that those areas where the depth to groundwater is within 5 feet are shown on the map, and 10 feet in purple as well. But just to give you an idea, so we were focusing on areas 1, areas 2, and areas 3 on this map. And area 3 does include this area with Mount Clair and Clifford Drive. And that area, I do have the summary of number of houses that are within that 5 foot, so within the green line, and then those within 10 feet, which are in between the green and the purple. So it does show there's 85 houses with shallow groundwater, and then 90 houses with groundwater within 10 feet. And so right now with this study, we did identify that Area 3 does need to have a better look at groundwater, and it potentially could be more problematic once we get to areas 5 and 6, because areas 5 and 6 also potentially could have groundwater issues as well. And so we are recommending to do a future groundwater study that includes monitoring wells within the project areas, and the approximate cost of that study is $50,000. So now I think I'm going to turn it over for just a little bit to Joe. He's going to go over costs.
Thank you, Cindy. Joe, to you, and just remember, state your name and your title.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. This is Joe LaLiberty with CDM Smith. Before I keep talking, can you all hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. Got my mic fixed. Okay, so Joe LaLiberty with CDM Smith, and I'm going to thank you, Cindy. So for the drainage system costs, we broke it out per the tiers that Cindy had mentioned. The sum, this is for the phase 1 study, which was areas 1, 2, and 3. And the top rated area was the feet, the original feet study area, which has recommendations of about, close to $26 million, and the total for all of the areas is $44 million. And you can see the tiers on the right-hand side based on what, Cindy had mentioned earlier. Next slide, Cindy. Cindy, can you go to the next slide? Okay, so then the collector drains, as Cindy had mentioned, this would be the portions of the work that is within the public right-of-way to take out the private connections. They are predominantly foundation drains. There are some sump pumps and possibly some roof leaders as well. But this would be the work to take those out. As Cindy had mentioned, the town would only proceed with this work if the MDC was partnering on the project and actually taking the private connections and connecting them over to these new drains. If that was the case, then in the feet area, which is the area that was the highest tier that you're considering to go forward with at this point, it would add an additional $5.4 million for the lateral drains that typically are located in the sidewalk, and basically give a place for those foundation drains to connect to with a sump pump, and just that they're not having a direct connection into the drain in the street. Next slide. So for funding options, that was one of the things that we had been asked to look at. One important note, and I know you all are aware, but all funding options require the town capital improvements bonding for the entire amount. So I'm going to go over a couple different options, but they would require, each of these would require that the town has a resolution in place to backstop the entire project, even if you did, say, receive a 75% grant, of which case you would only be, say, bonding 25%. So the couple that Cindy just flashed up, one is the Building Resilient Infrastructure Communities, or BRIC. That's one that I know the town is working on now. That has a 75% federal grant and then 25% non-federal, so that would be your match. It's for public infrastructure projects that would be similar to what we're talking about in the feet area that incorporate nature-based solutions and include adaptation. And the application is due in January of 2021. And again, that's one that we think is viable, and the town is currently proceeding with looking into that one. The other one that's mentioned here is the flood mitigation assistance through FEMA FMA grant. Similar grant percentages, but for this one, it requires the projects to have repetitive flood damage and be within the flood insurance program. So for the area, the drainage study that CDM Smith did, that Cindy had been summarizing, those homes don't fall within the flood insurance program, so they wouldn't apply for this grant application. But the study that Mylone and McBroom did that was in the Trout Brook area that Dwayne had mentioned, closer to the old Yukon campus, that area would, and so that an application for that area for those projects that were identified from that study is being put together for the application date in January of 2021. And then if those are likely the best two options, then Cindy, if you can hit the next, there you go, thank you. If those two don't come through, the next probably best thing would be the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, or otherwise known as wifia. So wifia doesn't have a grant, but one of the benefits is the low interest loan of the 1.27%. which is better than if you, borrowed from the state, which even the Clean Water Fund is at a 2% loan. So the catch is, though, is that it comes with a $100,000 application fee. But if you actually did get the loan, which covers 49% of the project, you'll see that financially it almost always is beneficial if you got the loan and you got that low interest rate. One of the other benefits of the wifia loan also is your payback period is over 35 years. So if you took out a loan on your portion, you could have the payback period be 20 years, and the payback period of the wifia would start 5 years after substantial completion and would go for a period of 30 years. So you'd actually have it where a good portion of it wouldn't even overlap. You'd basically be paying off half of the project with your loan and then, say, the other half with the other loan. And the other one I mentioned here at the bottom is the Connecticut DEP Clean Water Fund, which is a great grant and loan program. It has 50% grant for CSO projects, but West Hartford is located is a separated town. But one of the things with the integrated plan that we've made clear in our integrated plan submission is that any water that comes out of the sewer system has a direct benefit to the combined sewer system in Hartford. And so then therefore, why is it when I build a drain in Hartford to take out stormwater, it's eligible for 50% grant, but if I build a drain in West Hartford, it's not? So, if in my mind, if this town of Hartford and the MDC could band together and go to DEP, I think that you could make a strong case that the projects in Hartford should be eligible for the Clean Water Fund grant with the 50%. And then if that was the case, that might be the best avenue to go if you didn't get, say, the 75% from either of the top two lines. So next slide, Cindy. I think I'm turning it back over to you, though, at this point. Yes.
Yes. So I'm going to...
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Sorry, I should go through me, but just for clarity, thank you, Joe, very much. But, and Cindy, I'm sure we're going to have some questions. So I don't know if you want to pause for questions on this or keep going and then do questions. So would you like to, well, we'll just keep going.
Okay.
Let's go ahead.
Okay, so I am going to touch a little bit on another funding opportunity, which is a stormwater utility. And I wanted to kind of just do a little overview for those that are not as familiar with the stormwater utility. But stormwater utility starting in the 1970s, and it's a way to fund more equitably stormwater management programs. And right now, or typically those municipalities that do not have stormwater utilities, they actually are using the general fund. And so this graphic does show that typically with like a general fund, that single families are the predominant taxpayers that are paying a lot, and you get the tax exempt parcels pay nothing. Industrial typically pays less, commercial pays less. But once you do it based on impervious area, so you base it on the properties that have the most impervious area, it becomes more equitable, and you start having some of those tax exempt, whether it's a hospital or a university or a church or another place of worship, and even more the commercial, they are paying based on their impervious area, not based on the tax base. And so your funding for your stormwater projects becomes more equitable and more tied to who actually creates more stormwater runoff. And so we've done a few of these programs throughout New England, and the key to it is just engagement by stakeholders. And I wanted to give you a little background just on stormwater utilities in Connecticut. So Connecticut had a municipal separate storm sewer system permit in 2003. All majority of the municipalities in Connecticut are under this permit. And then in 2007, Connecticut DEP asked for municipalities to submit to be part of a pilot program to investigate the feasibility of doing a stormwater utility. And 3 of those municipalities actually conducted the studies, and it was New Haven, New London, and Norwalk. None of those municipalities moved forward with a stormwater utility at the time, but they did investigate, and those reports are available if you want to look at them. I can provide them. Then in 2017, the Connecticut DEP issued the new updated stormwater MS4 permit, and that's that municipal separate storm sewer system. And then in 2019, There was state enabling legislation that was trying to be pushed through to enable legal authority to establish a stormwater utility, and it ran into problems. And it was tied with other legislation at the time. But in 2020, there is a standalone bill allowing municipalities to form a stormwater utility without Connecticut DE approval. And unfortunately, I don't know the status of that right now, but that is what's going forward in Connecticut to allow legal authority to establish a stormwater utility. And I do have a graphic that just kind of shows in 2019, these are the stormwater utilities in the United States. There was 1,719 stormwater utilities within the United States. And with respect to New England, there's a handful. They're all in Massachusetts, Maine, and Vermont. And there's different types of stormwater utilities. So this kind of just gives you an overview of the different municipalities that have established stormwater utilities, whether, their monthly fees, their population, the year that it was established, and then the type is whether it's a ERU, which is equivalent residential unit, or F is fixed, and then T is a tiered type of stormwater fee, and then D is dual, which means it's residential and commercial. And the one thing I wanted to highlight is just the Portland one in Maine. And so that does use the ERU, which is the equivalent residential unit. And so they use that as the basis. And so it means if you are the standard residential unit, your monthly fee is $6 per year. And for this one, which was established in 2017, they get $3 million annually for their stormwater utilities, and it's proportioned based on your impervious area. So your residential will be paying $6 a month, but your big commercials or your hospitals or anyone that has large impervious areas are a multiplier of that. So your fee, your stormwater utility fee, is directly related to your impervious area. So now I'm just going to kind of go over the next steps. And so we did have, in November 2018, Malone and McBroom did the study for the St. Joseph's tributary area and the Trout Brook area. And then currently we're presenting tonight on the drainage study phase 1, which in June of this year, we finished the report on that study. We're having the town council meeting tonight. And then we have 2 public meetings scheduled for November on the 23rd and the 30th. And then the town is working on the grant submissions in January of 2021. And then our MDC coordination is ongoing. And then we just wanted to mention that we should support the stormwater utility legislation. And then with respect to phase 2, which is areas 4, 5, and 6, we started the drainage study, and we anticipate having a draft report in 2021, February 2021. And then in the spring, we will have town council and public information meetings on phase 2. And so that concludes our presentation, and we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Cindy. I'm going to go now to the town manager, who has some remarks before we open the floor up for questions.
Okay.
Mr. Howard.
Thank you, Mayor. Matt Hart, Town Manager. Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Dwayne, for the presentation. Town Council, obviously you can see this is a very significant project for the town. One that would likely need to be performed over a period of years, would require a substantial investment on our part. Those priority areas that Joe and Cindy identified, that work totals roughly $30 million. They've identified potential funding options to offset the town's costs. But ultimately, you will be in a position where you would need to authorize us to either accept the grants, if we're fortunate and we receive them, and to authorize the bonds that would cover the town share of any project. So very, very important initiative for the town. Normally, we would take this through one of our standing committees, but in the current environment, we're meeting as a committee of the whole. And this is also of significant interest to the affected neighborhoods in town. And we want to make sure that you had this information that we could respond to any questions you have before we conduct those public information sessions. So I just wanted to touch on those points before we go to Q&A, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. It's a little echoey, so if anyone has their mics on, just make sure if you're not speaking to mute. All right, I'm going to actually just start with the funding, and it's a combination of Joe and Cindy, actually, was the grant. Is there the opportunity, I'll go to Joe first, is there the opportunity to combine grants? For instance, the first FEMA grant that Trout Brook might be eligible for, and the DEEP grant, is there the opportunity to combine those? And then one step further, is there an opportunity then, if legislation does pass and we can find a structure that works for West Hartford, with the stormwater, with the remainder of the municipal, could we fund that through a stormwater utility? So those are my questions.
Okay, thank you, Mayor. Joe Liberty with CDM Smith. So typically with these funding opportunities, typically you cannot combine them. If DEP did allow, did say that this project was eligible for clean water funds, and you did say get the BRIC funding, it would be a question for them. They do have some leeway with their funding, but typically, it's one or the other. And then the other question you asked was, if you had a stormwater utility, could you still proceed with these grants? Absolutely, yes. How you fund it on your side for your match is it can be done either through the through the stormwater utility. It can be done through the way that you're currently doing it now, through the tax base.
Thank you, Joe. That was my assumption. But we have areas that might qualify for BRIC and others that might qualify for the Connecticut DEEP. As you said, the West Hartford stormwater goes right into Hartford and is impacting the whole system. Can you mix and match, I guess, is not necessarily layering them on top of each other, but if you took individual areas, for instance, that first phase 1 and then phase 2.
Yes, I think that if you were looking at specific areas, I think that would work. For instance, the Mylona McBroom study was in that upper Trout Brook sewer drainage shed, near the old Yukon campus in St. Joseph's. So yes, I think that you could submit a separate grant application for the FMA assistance, and you could separately be doing, say, the feet area through either DEP or the BRIC funding. I just don't know if you had a specific area, if you could do both funding for that same area, but I definitely believe you can separate the different areas with different fundings.
Thank you. Okay, and now I will open up actually, I'm going to go in alphabet. It's really hard to see everybody and with the everything up. So I'm going to just go through. I'll call on counselors. Counselor Blanks, do you have any questions?
I'm going to pass since I came in late. May I reserve my time towards the end?
You sure can. Okay, Mr. Davidoff, do you have any questions?
No questions.
Okay. Mary, any questions?
Sorry about that. We couldn't hear you at all.
I know, Mary, any questions? Yep.
Oh, no, thank you. I'm good for now.
Okay. Beth, any questions?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay. Lamb, any questions? I know I missed. Go ahead, Lamb. Lamb, any questions?
I'm all set, Mayor. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Birthday boy Ben, any questions?
Hold on, let me, 1 second. Sorry, I actually do. Can we just, I was just trying to make a comparison, trying to understand the screen, page 9 of the PowerPoint the modeled flooding compared to the needs assessment. And I was a little confused by that. Right. So what this is showing is the 10-year design storm. That's a theoretical based on your modeling. The other three are actual.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, thank you.
Cindy Bowman.
Yep, Cindy, go ahead.
Yes, so the Tropical Storm Lee, the 2018 storms, and the August 2019 storms were actual storms. We got rainfall data for and modeled.
Okay. And so all the blank ones are that, so we even had a few that you modeled, you thought there'd be a problem on a 10-year storm, but they still didn't.
Correct.
Okay. And then does that match up directly to the other side where you pick the priorities?
Yes, so all of the ones with check marks on this screen are the 13 that are either red, green, or black in the tiered priority list. So there's 21 here, but only 13 that have check marks. And then those with 4 check marks will either be a tier 1 or a tier 2. Those with only 1 check mark are tier 3.
Okay. And the difference between tier 1 and 2 is whether or not, I know you have the groundwater issue.
Yeah, it was more to the how the modeling, because we actually got figures showing the locations of modeling for these other storms, the 2018, the 2 storms in 2018, the 2019 storm, and Tropical Storm Lee. We got different maps showing the locations of flooding, and so it was prioritized based on more the magnitude and the amount of flooding.
So tier 1, you had observed flooding and the model showed flooding. Tier 2, the model is suggesting that there would be flooding, but we don't have information from the town that said that there actually was flooding there during those storms. So there may have been or there may not have been, but the model is suggesting that there is.
Got it. Okay.
Yep.
And then just on that prioritization map, I understand the feet trunk is the huge piece, but so the areas where we have the groundwater, the photos you showed, where do they show up on the?
Well, like this one, Mount Clair.
Right.
That one does have high groundwater.
Okay.
So, and Leonard has high groundwater.
And Lynbrook.
And
Right.
Lynbrook does, yeah. But
Yeah,
Lynbrook
I'm surprised that Lynbrook and Leonard showed up in category 3 or 2, because I thought those were. Or did they?
So the ranking was heavily based on our study was done to, the whole premise of starting the study was to resolve town flooding, like within the streets. Those areas don't have as much town flooding, but they do have a groundwater problem, which is a separate issue than town flooding on the streets where you wouldn't be able to get emergency vehicles by or whatever. It's groundwater versus surface water.
Okay. So those issues, those are separate from this. This is really the streets. And those issues they have with the groundwater. Is that part of this spending? I mean, are we looking at something separate for them, or does that somehow get included in these costs?
Do you want to start, Joe, with the collector drains?
So the collector drains will take the private connections, the foundation drains out of the sewer and put them in the drain. But the groundwater is in that area of Montclair and Lynbrook and Leonard. It wasn't the focal point of this original study. We did realize early on when we had the town meeting where a lot of, the people who were there, they showed the videos, they talked about how they think that Trout Brook used to go right through the area, and we wound up finding out that they were right. And so it is a groundwater issue. So it's why we've recommended that the town consider proceeding with a groundwater study to address those, to look at what would need to be done to address those issues, because the study to date didn't address the groundwater, it addressed the surface water.
Got it. Okay. Well, thank you for the clarification. I don't have any other questions.
Thank you, Ben. Mr. Williams, Chris. Was Chris here? I thought so. Chris?
Sorry, I had a hard time figuring it out with the presentation box up. But in
Okay,
any event, no questions. Thank you for the presentation.
thank you. Okay, just to, a couple more. Remember, this is just phase 1, 2, and 3 that we're seeing, confirming that, correct? Yes.
Phase
Correct.
1 of 2.
Yes, phase 1 of 2. And the MDC connections that you had, the 13 million, the slide with the 13 million on it, if you could go back to that one. Again, this is Mayor Cantor. I'm talking Cindy Bauman from CDM. Okay, yeah, there we go. So this would have a shared responsibility because the private connections to the road would be that was assumed to be a potentially MDC, correct? So could you, without that, so I'm reading this. Can you just review what then the MDC would cover and what the town would cover? Just, I'm in your proposed scenario.
Understand, Mayor. This is Joe LaLiberty with CDM Smith again. So the drainage study, the drainage improvements that Cindy, walked through would address your flooding issues in the town of West Hartford in those areas, right? This slide here. What the next slide, what you're asking about, is the collector drains and whatnot, and I understand. So these collector drains are to address the fact that we have a lot of homes in the area that have their foundation drains and sump pumps that currently go into the sewer system when they should go into the drainage system. And so if the town just went forward with the drainage improvements in the street, they would address the street flooding, but people may still get water in their basements or sewer in their basement because that wouldn't have been addressed. What you're looking at with this slide here is the town's cost within the public right-of-way to extend service laterals to the property line of the homes that have known connections. What the MDC share would be is not shown on this slide. They were to take up the connection from the home, go inside the home, put a sump pump, similar to what we did in 4 Mile Road in Greenhurst. We went into each of those homes, we put a sump pump in, we did new piping, and we piped it over to the new drainage system. So they would be handling all of the work on the private property, which is roughly around the same cost that you're looking at here would be their commitment. So when we had said it doesn't make sense to move forward with this if the MDC isn't coordinating with you, because you're not going to go and the MDC would be the one that would be paying to do all the building inspections to determine where the connections would go. And if they're not going to be coordinating with the effort, then it wouldn't make sense for you to go and leave private laterals, and then nobody would have connected the drainage into them. So this portion of the work would require coordination between the two.
Okay, and would any of their work qualify for grant? I mean, we pay for, we're part of that municipality. So is any of their costs covered or could be covered by that DEEP grant or something else? Or would they qualify?
So DEP has not covered work on private property with any grant or loan. They have said with this whole integrated plan going forward that they'd be willing to entertain possibly changing their regulations and allowing the private property work to be counted. But if this project was in Hartford, because Hartford is a combined city versus West Hartford is a separated town, you have a separated sewer and drainage system. If this project was in Hartford, all of this work you're looking at on this slide would be eligible for 50% grant. DEP pays for all of the work up to the property line. They do not pay for the work on the private property. So that's where I'm saying, just because the project is in West Hartford, it's accomplishing the same thing as if it was in Hartford.
All right, okay. All right, well, that's all I have right now. I'm sure as we, this is as our town manager said, as Matt said, this is a huge project and a huge,
Madam Mayor?
Yes, sorry, Mr. Sweeney, go ahead.
I just have a follow-up question to that. Hey, Joe, this is Councilman Liam Sweeney. Could you point us into the statute of where that is? I think one of the things that would be great to know is if statute could be adjusted to allow for West Hartford to fall somewhere closer to the needs of what DEEP is looking at. It's potentially something that we could explore with our delegation.
Yeah, I think that's something I can follow up with Dwayne. I don't, and I'm sure he can then forward it on to all of you. But it's their funding, the Clean Water Fund. They have these different types of projects. Some might be nitrogen removal. There could be phosphorus removal, and then there's combined sewer overflow projects, CSO, and they have funding grant percentages for each of those types of projects. For CSO, the grant is 50%. West Hartford, historically, the work in West Hartford hasn't qualified for that work because it's considered a separated town. So what we would need to do with the MDC and the town of West Hartford together to go to DEP and say, this is still part of the CSO collection system because it drains into Hartford, which is a CSO system. So I don't know if they have to change the regulations. They just need to acknowledge the fact that any water that goes into the system is impacting the system in Hartford.
Through you, Madam Mayor.
Mr. Sweeney, go ahead.
So we would be relying on DEP to make a favorable ruling in our case. Is that what you're saying?
Correct. That's what I'm saying. Yes. And I think it would take, the leadership at MDC, it would take the leadership at West Hartford, and quite frankly, I think it probably would take the, state, and local representatives to get involved as well to try to put pressure on them to see if they can count this as a CSO project.
Thank you, Joe.
So basically, through you, Madam Mayor.
Mm-hmm.
So basically the same thing that would be required to put this in statute.
Well, I mean, that's an option, right? If there's no cooperation with DEEP once it's explained, and to be honest, Mr. Sweeney, I think that these areas that we have been looking at don't have they are combined in many ways. I mean, the system is carrying all of this water that it shouldn't be carrying, so it's fundamentally the same. I think. Joe, am I right?
I agree with you.
Through you, Madam Mayor. I totally agree. I think that I think asking DEEP to interpret in our favor is basically playing the lottery, and I think that it's something that we should explore going forward.
Yeah, I think more to follow, I'm sure. Okay. Anything else from other counselors? If you do, just say.
Madam Mayor, hi, through you, Lee Gold.
Yes, Mr. Gold. Oh my gosh, Mr. Gold. Yes, your question. Oh my gosh, go ahead.
Anyways, thank you, through you. I just want to be clear. So the inadequate sewer systems adding the groundwater problem, that's a general concept. And that's why we're going into, I guess, the integrated plan, and that's what we're thinking about. But I wanted to go back a little bit. You had mentioned 3 municipalities. I think it was New Haven, London, Norwalk. I know it was about 13 years ago, but what was the reason why, if we know, that they didn't go into and be part of the stormwater utility plan?
Thank you, Mr. Gold. Yeah, I think.
Mayor, this is Cindy Bauman. And the 3 municipalities did do a study at the time, and the big hurdle at that time was the legislation, because they could not legally create a stormwater utility. So,
Okay, so just, Mr. Gold, go ahead. You have a question?
No, so now in theory, we have that, potentially have that ability to do that.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, please?
Mr. Gold, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, and through you, Mayor. So now in theory, we have the ability to do that and have that option, correct?
There is legislation, this is Cindy Bauman, and there is legislation that requires Connecticut DEP approval, but the current legislation this year is trying to push forward legislation that will allow municipalities to create a stormwater utility without Connecticut DEP approval. They can just do it on their own. So.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So right now there was proposed legislation that did not pass. It was pulled actually. So at the end of last legislative session. So, Mr. Gold, anything further?
I'm all set. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Davidoff, did you have a question? I'm not sure.
All set, Madam Mayor.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you again, Cindy. Thank you, Joe. Mr. Hart, do you just want to just review next steps one more time, and then we will move on to our next agenda item. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Matt Hart, Town Manager, and thank you, Cindy and Joe, again, for your presentation. In terms of next steps, we plan to conduct public information sessions, which are of, again, we pointed to the fact that the neighborhoods that are affected here, they're acutely interested in this topic. So we want to make sure that we're able to make a similar presentation to them and handle Q&A. Number two, we're working on those grant submissions that we would need to eventually bring to you. And then also, we're coordinating with the MDC because on the separation issues, as Joe described, it's only going to make sense to do those projects if they work with us. And what we've discussed with the MDC in the past is that the town would be responsible, generally speaking, for what's in the right-of-way, and the MDC would be responsible for the connection from the home to our pipe in the right-of-way. And then last but certainly not least, we want to support legislation in the upcoming session to allow municipalities in Connecticut to create a stormwater utility. And we would work with CCM and our delegation on that issue.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hart. So that was a long presentation and a lot of information in there, and really important, and will have a big impact to our whole community eventually. If whatever happens, it's going to impact all of us. So, all right, now, then again, thank you, Cindy and Joe. You are free to leave. You can stay for our next item, but you know.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
He's on vacation, so thanks for.
I'm on vacation, so I'm going to go back to vacation mode. Have a good night.
All right, bye-bye.
Thank you, Mayor.
Be well, safe. Bye. Okay, and then we'll go back to A, which is ordinance permitting accessory dwelling units. Oh, for the record, Carol Blanks and Beth Kerrigan are both present. I just want to make sure that is on the record. So we will go back to the ordinance permitting accessory dwelling units in one family resident district draft. I think we had some questions on this. We did not have the draft ordinance ready at our last meeting, and so tonight we do. So right now I will go to Mr. Hart to start the discussion on this.
Thank you, Mayor. Matt Hart, Town Manager. Council will recall we have been discussing this important item over the last couple of meetings. We are at the step now where we are ready to propose draft legislation to you. Recall last time around we talked about what would be included or what the essential elements of an ordinance would be. Tonight we actually have a proposed piece of legislation to present. We also received some questions from you last time that we want to respond to tonight as well. So what you'll see attached are an updated memo from Todd Dumais, our town planner. We've also included the memo we presented last time, as well as our proposed ordinance. You know, if we're able to sufficiently respond to your questions this evening, and if the consensus is to move forward, we would then bring the ordinance to the town council at one of your regular meetings and go through our normal council review and adoption process. So I'd like to pause there, Mayor, and ask Mr. Dumais to touch upon the items that we've provided in tonight's packet.
Thank you, Mr. Hart. Mr. Dumais?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Todd Dumais, for the record, town planner. I'd like to start first by addressing essentially the three questions that were asked both during and after our meeting in September on this topic. And those three questions largely revolve around one, was there any impact analysis done for the community with respect to ADUs on property values for the ADU or for adjacent properties? Was there any impact analysis done by any of the peer communities? Remember, we provided 14 municipalities legislation ordinances that included their ADU provisions. And then also, what were the total quantities of ADUs within those communities in which we polled? So I'll start at the end of that question first. I reached back out to all 14 communities since our last meeting. I heard back from 7 of them. Of those 7 municipalities, only 3 track in any meaningful way on a database or a system their ADUs, but a total of 4 of those communities provided answer to the question, the direct question, and it was Fairfield had the most with 175 ADUs. Glastonbury had 79 ADUs on file, and they did note that their records only go back reliably to the early 90s. There was less than 50 reported for Windsor and approximately 35 for Wethersfield. Since that time, during our last meeting, I discussed a number that we had not more than 70 detached accessory dwelling units here in town. Those are either compliant dwelling units that have less than 3 rooms on lots that are either double the minimum size in their area, or they're largely, based on the assessment records, probably historically what we'd consider grandfathered uses, meaning that they've been in place longer than we've had an ordinance governing them. Remember, we discussed last meeting that our current language goes back to the early 70s. So those units clearly, many of them predate that number. Since that time, my staff has gone through the assessment records and tried to verify that, and we believe our number closer to 33 units. So it's not 70. We're able to tease out from the assessment records those assessed values that were picked up for improved habitable space, but they weren't considered a full dwelling unit, meaning they didn't have a kitchen, bathroom, and a bedroom. So we're at about 33. I next asked the question, how many applications for accessory dwelling units do you receive per year? Again, Fairfield was the highest with an average of 5 to 6 applications for ADUs each year. And then every other municipality, even those that did not track total number of ADUs, reported they receiving an average of between 1 or 2 applications for an ADU per year. So I think that answers, best I could, given the information provided to me by our adjacent municipalities, that part of the question. All 14 communities, again, the 7 that responded, not a single one has ever done any type of economic analysis or assessment on the question that was provided, so they had no information. Again, that largely tracks with what I reported during our last meeting, that I could not find any peer literature in the planning field on that exact question. So we tried to do the next best thing. We asked our town assessor to take any information he had on our 33 units here in town and do an analysis whether or not he could determine if there's any value impact of an ADU on adjacent property values. I included that language directly from Mr. Dakers in my updated memo to you. They did a sales ratio study, and you will see, it's a limited sample size. It relies on sales since our last reeval, so that was 7 of these 33 units. But based on those 7, he was able to determine there was no adverse impact of property values. He also, for the record, pointed out that he reviewed the International Association of Assessing Officers Library and the Appraisal Institute's Appraisal Journal for other peer-reviewed literature on this exact topic and could not find any formal writing or literature. So I think I did my best to answer the three questions that were presented, and I'll pause there, and I can open it to any further questions, Mayor, or I could also provide an overview of the ordinance that I was requested to prepare.
Are there any follow-up on those questions for Mr. Dumais and Mr. Gold?
Yes, one of the other questions I had was dealing with the economic impacts of our town services, dealing with police, fire, sanitation, schools, parking, all those things. But as I'm hearing what you're saying, with an addition of one or two a year, it goes back to actually what Mary had mentioned the last time, which is, why is there a need for this? But if this does get opened up and there is a tremendous push for it, how much impact on our town will it have, and how much will the assessed value of our homes in town increase based on having an 800 square foot piece of property attached to my home, for an example, where I can put in a kitchen, a full bath, 3 bedrooms, put in 6 college students in the back, and here we are, and I can charge $1,500. I now then have a hybrid home, and you're kind of overlaying on the entire town and our multifamily housing rather than R1s. So you're kind of changing the entire dynamic of the town. How much stress will that actually put on the town? Will we get value back out of taxing our residents to accommodate this to then offset the costs for the services in town?
Thank you, Mr. Gold. There was a lot in there. Mr. Dumais, go ahead, and then I don't know if the town manager wants to also talk about some of that, or anybody else. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Todd Dumais, through you to Councilor Gold. Again, there isn't a great deal of literature on service impact out in the field. However, I don't think there is a significant number of units based on our peer communities that we've surveyed. You certainly could not rent one of these units to 6 college students. Keep in mind, we have existing ordinances that restrict the rental of any property in town or dwelling unit to a housekeeping or family unit that is defined as no more than 3 unrelated individuals. So in your scenario, Councilor Gold, I suppose you could, if the ADU provided, rent to 3 college age individuals, but certainly not 6. We also have a provision against transient housing, meaning that we cannot and do not permit transient housing type. So it has to be long-term stay, and that's generally been interpreted and applied as a 180-day lease or longer on any rental or apartment unit in town. I do not have a direct answer to your question on impact to services. Again, I have not seen that literature out in the field, and certainly any of the peer communities that I polled did not have any answer for that question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Mr. Gold?
And through you, Mayor, back to Todd, you talk about transient in 180 days. Obviously, there are month-to-month tenancies that exist. When a lease expires, you automatically move into a month-to-month lease. So that exists. But be that as it may, you talk about transient, and this kind of creates that concept in town where, let's say it is 180 days. So you're rolling people through a property every 6 months. So you're creating, effectively, if the whole town decides that this is where we're going and we want to have some gentle density growth in areas around TODs and other situations, then you are creating a more transient community, 180 days or so. But where is then the procedure to put in place to monitor what's going on? I see in the proposed ordinance statute that you were putting together that it's going to go back to the town planner. You get an affidavit, you get something every year, but who's enforcing this? How's that actually going to be processed? And are we going to be spot checking certain areas and looking through the entire town for a violator? And then are we going to be spending town resources to do that too?
So maybe it's a good time to go through the ordinance now, and then we can ask questions, because the ordinance does have a number of things in it, right? I mean, Mr. Dumais, you can to that. So why don't we walk through the ordinance, and then if there are questions again about either questions particular to the ordinance or questions on enforcement, we can talk about how staff handles those issues. I mean, I have a rental, or I did have rental property. Mr. Wold does rental. I mean, there's lots of we all know how the credit, whatever, doesn't matter. But anyway, Mr. Dumais, would you like to review the ordinance?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'd be happy to. So the ordinance that was shared with you, this is just a first draft. You'll see the first part of the ordinance is quote unquote a statement of purpose. And this largely reflects our discussion that we had about our peer review of model ADU ordinances throughout the country and how we structure them. This was particularly structured to fit within the construct or way West Hartford has historically crafted its zoning ordinances. So the first part is a statement that suggests in furtherance of the neighborhoods and housing goal of the Plan of Conservation and Development to enhance, maintain neighborhoods and encourage diversity of housing types and costs, to provide access and availability of housing options to current and future residents in any one-family residence district, a dwelling unit or accessory building may be converted to allow the incorporation of one accessory dwelling unit, which is subordinate and incidental to the principal dwelling unit, and which contains its own kitchen, bathroom, and sleeping facilities, subject to the following requirements. So that's a statement of purpose, but it also identifies where an accessory dwelling unit under this draft would be permitted, and that states in all single-family zoning districts. It also limits the total number of accessory dwelling units to not more than one, and it has to be subordinate and incidental to the primary dwelling unit. The next section of the ordinance talks about the lot has to contain the minimum required lot size for whatever district it's in, meaning that if you had an undersized lot, so if you're in the R10 zone and that zone requires 10,500 square feet of land area, if you had an undersized lot of only 7,000 square feet, you would not be eligible for the addition of an ADU. The next set of standards, subsection 2, talks about the size, location, and appearance. This is as we discussed at our previous meetings, a critical component of any ordinance because it outlines how large of a unit you can allow, what the critical requirements are. In this draft, it says that any minimum accessory dwelling unit have a minimum gross floor area of 400 square feet. That's to prevent so-called micro units, really small, tiny units. But have a maximum gross floor area of 800 square feet or 30% of the gross floor area of the principal dwelling, whichever is less. Remember, we talked about that having a ratio, regardless of an ADU or any other ordinance, it is important to provide flexibility because we do see a dramatic size in homes, even within permitted zones. So you can have some homes that are much larger in the same zone. This provides some flexibility to scale up an ADU but still caps it at two numbers. Similarly, the suggested ordinance also imposes a limitation of increase in square foot of coverage of not more than 30%. So building footprint is lot coverage to accommodate any accessory dwelling unit. And in no case shall the requirements 177.6D and 177.20, those two standards are standards for our single-family zones that deal with setbacks, lot coverage. In no case can those be exceeded. So you still have to meet all of the standards that you find in that zone for the total dwellings. So you're not being given any special permission to build above and beyond what's otherwise required or limited in that zone. The next suggested provision is we shall not allow accessory dwelling units in basements unless one wall within the apartment opens to grade and contains both windows and walkout ingress and egress. The next is a setback provision. If there is an accessory dwelling unit to be located in a detached building, that should observe a minimum side and rear yard of 10 feet. That side and rear yard standard is found in all of our single family zones in the larger zones for detached accessory structures. In our smaller zones, our R13, R6, R10, those zones have much smaller setback provisions for detached structures. So if you were to build a detached garage or shed in those zones, you only need to observe, in some instances, 2 feet off the property line. So we're suggesting, since this could potentially be created or converted to habitable space, you have to step it back at least 10 feet. The next substandard, subsection, section E, is trying to incorporate feedback that we heard is very important to preserve the one-family residential character of the building. And to do that, we're suggesting that the ADU unit be oriented to the maximum extent practical to maintain the privacy of residents and adjacent dwellings through proper placement of windows, doors, and landscaping and screening. It be constructed of durable, permanent materials that match or are complementary to the exterior facade of the primary dwelling. That it include roof shapes that match the architectural style and use of materials that match or are complementary to those of the primary dwelling unit. Again, trying to make sure that if one of these goes in, it looks like it's been on the property or part of the property. The exterior access to a dwelling unit shall be located to the side or the rear of the primary dwelling, and not be visible from the street. Again, that's trying to preserve the character. There's a provision in here for parking that you have to provide for at least one off-street parking space, subject to our parking requirements, and that the total required off-street parking for whatever the primary dwelling unit is shall not be reduced. Meaning, if you were going to convert an accessory garage and that provided for 2 parking spaces for the primary dwelling, you couldn't replace those without, providing for more parking. This also suggests not adding any new curb cuts, trying to limit the amount of impervious surface created for any accessory dwelling unit. There's a provision in here that the principal dwelling unit or accessory apartment shall be owner occupied, with a provision that if it's rented, there needs to be filed an affidavit of ownership, essentially, for either the primary dwelling unit. It's filed with my office before the end of each year. Another statement in here that any accessory apartment created under this standard should conform to all the requirements of any applicable building, health, fire, or sanitary codes, in addition to those set forth above. This outlines an application procedure. The first step in that process is in all single-family zoning districts, an application for an ADU would be subject to the site plan provisions of 17742B. If you'll recall, site plan provisions are an administrative level review that goes through my office. If all of the standards are met that are outlined within the zoning, either in this subsection or any other applicable standard in the zoning, it's an administrative level review and approval. It does not go to a planning and zoning commission or council level action. Having said that, because there is just an administrative process, this draft includes some public notice provision. And that notice is that if my office were to receive an application for an accessory dwelling unit, I would then be required to send by certificate of mailing a copy of the application to all owners of the adjoining property, which is the subject of the application. In addition, the applicant would be required to post a sign giving notice of the application on the property that's visible from the street, and it should be posted from the date the application is received by my office and remain up until a decision is made on the application. Lastly, included in this draft is a provision, this is a so-called sunset clause, that says that this subsection that we just discussed, permitting accessory dwelling units in one-family districts, would expire on December 31st, 2023, unless the council, acting as your zoning authority, readopts this subsection. That is the ordinance. I'll pause there and I'll open it up to any further questions there.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Mr. Hart, do you want to make any comments too on the ordinance or overall, and then we'll take some questions from the council?
I do, Mayor. Matt Hart, Town Manager. Thank you, Mr. Dumais, for your good presentation. I wanted to add to Mr. Dumais' response to Councilor Gold with respect to impact on municipal services. And let me touch on four things altogether. Number one, for residential projects and initiatives, typically you're only going to see a significant impact, if you will, for projects that will result and a significant increase in the number of school children in town. You know, we do not think, the experience does not demonstrate that these types of units result in that. You know, typically you do not see tenants with school children, residing in ADUs. Secondly, looking at quality of life impacts, might there be problematic tenants that are creating issues in the neighborhood? You know, the evidence that we've looked at from the peer review communities doesn't suggest that either. Also, to that point, this draft would require the property to be owner occupied. And based on my experience working for a long time in a university community, when the owner also lives on site, really helps to control any quality of life issues. Third, could there be an impact to zoning? Yes, conceivably, in terms of an administrative burden, in terms of tracking these, making sure that the owner files on an annual basis, etc. There would be something of an increase in the administrative burden associated with that activity. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on the point Mr. Dumais made. We have drafted this with a sunset clause. You know, so this would give the community time to see how this works out, you know, a 3-year period. And if our experience is similar to what other Connecticut towns have experienced, this probably will, the results will probably only be positive. But if there are any that are negative to any significant degree, the council will have the opportunity to decide not to extend the provision further. So I just wanted to add those points to Mr. Dumais' earlier response, and happy to assist with any other questions as well, Mayor. Mr. Dumais has a point he'd like to add.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Hart. Mr. Dumais?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Yes, I'd also like to comment that, you know, expanding or opening up our accessory dwelling ordinance is not changing single-family zoning into multifamily zoning. You know, this is an accessory use. It's accessory building. It's by definition supposed to be smaller than and subordinate to the primary unit. And I'd like to point out, we've allowed accessory dwelling units in our community for at least 60 years, but much longer than that based on the track record we have. And I don't think I've seen any complaints. I have certainly tracked that in the last 5 years. In the 33 we haven't received complaints on those units we have in town. But we've have allowed them, and this is an effort to, I guess, right-size the regulations in place to try to keep up and be forward thinking to expand housing choice and to provide another type of housing choice that's currently restricted by the ordinance, and opening it up to more people, existing residents or future residents that want to locate in West Hartford. That's the point I'd like to make. Thanks, Mayor.
Sorry, my mute button's taking a while. Thank you, Mr. Dumais. All right, with that, I guess we can go through the council. So I'll go in reverse order, and I will not forget Mr. Gold this time. I apologize for that. We can go to Mr. Williams. Do you have any questions, comments for staff on the ordinance?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Hart and Mr. Dumais, for your presentations. So I have a procedural question and then sort of a substantive one. On the procedure, it's just, Mr. Hart, where do we go from here? I know planning and zoning is involved in this. How is that going to work with us and our schedule? And also, is there going to be a public hearing on this issue? So that's the procedural piece. And then in terms of the actual legislation, I'm still stuck on why we're doing this. I hear what Mr. Dumais is saying in terms of the town goals. But in West Hartford, we have multifamily, we have apartment, we have single family. I know I've lived in all three over my time here. But in any event, there's a recognition in our town and even in this ordinance that there's something unique to preserve about single family residential. And that's why I think it's expressed in this statute that if there's an ADU, it has to maintain the residential character of the dwelling or building. And also, there's this sunset provision, which suggests that if this doesn't work out, we'll stop it. So both of those two parts sort of increase my concern, because when I've seen zoning applications fall before this committee or this council in the past, it's because residents who have invested in a certain neighborhood or an area have done so in reliance that zoning is going to be maintained in a consistent fashion at the time that they make the purchase. And when applications have gone down, it's because what has been proposed stands in stark contrast to the zoning in place when they purchased the property. And so it's unfair to those residents who have made an investment in reliance on the town to approve that application. That's what I've seen. And so what I see here is, yes, we want affordable housing in town. Yes, we want to have an array of different options, and we do have a lot of different options. I know that we've discussed that before, but what we're doing is we're changing what is able to be done in single family zoned areas beyond what was able to be done at the time that residents purchased. And I think that's a substantial consideration here, because there's good policy goals here, but I don't know that this is the way to go about it, because it feels experimental. When you have things like sunset provisions in here, and you have an emphasis on needing to maintain the character of residential single family, and then we put all these options of taking a different direction from that. So that's why I have pause, and I'm not clear that this is really a policy to address an issue we have, other than, I mean, it's not clear to me that we have evidence right now that there's not sufficient diversity in housing in town, because I think at this table we've established just the opposite, that we do have a diversity of housing in town. So I'm just confused as to the purpose here. And I don't know if someone wants to speak to that or not, but thank you.
Thank you. This was talked about in some length, I think, for the POCD, so maybe Mr. Dumais wants to address that. But Mr. Hart, do you want to talk about the procedural? This is an ordinance, and the procedures that we obviously would go through, but how TPC and all of that. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor. Matt Hart, Town Manager. Thank you, Councilor Williams, for your question. In terms of procedure, it would be the same as any other zoning ordinance. So this would need to be, it would need to be presented to the council in regular session at a regular meeting. You would need to receive it. You would need to refer it to TPZ. I would think CROG as well. Schedule a public hearing, and then look at adopting it based on the reports you receive from the referrals and following the public hearing. Just like any other zoning ordinance.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Hart. Mr. Williams, any question on that piece? No? That's okay. Okay, Mr. Dumais, do you want to talk about maybe what was discussed, and then the inclusion of that in the POCD? I don't remember what page it's on, but I remember I saw it. I don't know if you want to talk about that, or even Fairfield, if you reached out. They seem to have the most units. What the need? I don't know. Whatever.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Todd Dumais, through you to Councilor Williams. There's an acknowledgement in the POCD that we need to enhance the type of housing choice and diversity that we have in town. And Councilor Williams, you are correct. When compared to some of our adjacent communities, we do have more housing diversity and choice. We have approximately 65% single family housing stock, 7% perhaps two family, and then the balance of that is mixed between multifamily or assisted living facilities. But there's acknowledgement that perhaps we need to do more. We do know that the demographics are changing. West Hartford is an aging community, like all of the Northeast. This type of housing clearly is an avenue and does work well for folks who want to age in place. We talked about that at prior meetings. It's also a type of housing that allows communities to grow in place for family members who want to bring children back into the home. Perhaps they're young professionals, but they want to stay close to home, but they want their own place. It provides that opportunity. Remember, the Plan of Conservation and Development is a forward-thinking document that tries to look ahead and anticipate the needs of the community. I'll address the sunset clause issue. That was really thrown in there to try to give folks comfort that there'd be an opportunity to re-examine this. I would agree, we don't need it. We could take that out. The council always has the authority to bring back an ordinance or amendment to change any of its zoning or eliminate it. It's not needed. It just called attention to it. And I can understand, Councilor Williams, why you feel that that provision in particular makes it feel perhaps experimental. We've done that in the past with some other newer zoning language. I recall on the alternative energy systems, we had a similar provision in there with a sunset clause. So that's why that was in there, to perhaps give folks comfort that there'd be another opportunity to review this, but it perhaps is not needed because the council has that authority as the zoning authority to do at any point in the future. The other issue I'd like to go back to, again, this isn't necessarily changing what we're allowing, because we allow this in all of our single family zoning today. It's just we have standards that are so unpermissive that it makes the practical delivery and development of ADUs impractical. So there was a decision made at some point in the past that, hey, these are okay, but you need to have twice the lot area, and they can only be 3 rooms, so basically a studio unit. And we've done that and had that in place for over 60 years. That's my answer to your questions, but I'd be happy to take more, Councilor Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. So I want to get through everybody. Mr. Williams, I don't know if you had any follow-up, but if you don't mind, okay. Mr. Winograd.
Thank you. I just want to point out, since I did pull it up, the POCD. It is in the implementation summary, items really 4A through D that talk about these sorts of things. The entire chapter, the neighborhood and housing goal, enhance and maintain West Hartford's existing neighborhoods and encourage diversity of housing types and costs to provide access and availability of housing options to current and future residents. And again, I think the future that's part of the idea that in fact we are looking at the future and the types of housing that people are looking for, and that is in fact what we all agree to in terms of the POCD, that we were as a broader goal, and we did in fact even in the POCD mention the study of modifications, targeted modifications, and innovative opportunities such as accessory dwelling unit. So, this is not a new concept. I'll ask Todd, and just in terms of the TPZ and their actions, this was, when they discussed the POCD and drafted it ultimately for our approval. Can you talk a little bit about the discussions they had in terms of modernizing zoning rules, what the purpose of putting future residents in as part of that?
Thank you, Mr. Winograd. Mr. Dumais.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Through you to Councilor Winograd. I'll do that, and I'd like to point out, and I should have in answering Councilor Williams' question, when we look at our POCD, something that was unique that we did not have in any year past, we applied what we called guiding lenses to the document, meaning that any decision that was being made need to be made through one of 4 guiding lenses that helped guide and construct the whole document. Those guiding lenses were sustainability, connectivity, equity, and innovation. I think in particular, the ADUs or housing in general, when we apply the guiding lens for both sustainability and innovation, innovation as we applied or defined that lens was West Hartford will continue to embrace creative and innovative thinking to promote the town's continued successful evolution. And perhaps that's what we're talking about, an evolution of housing type and choice that we don't have a lot of today. Sustainability also, West Hartford will continue to manage resources to promote welfare and equity for current and future generations by encouraging interconnected green space, multimodal transportation system, efficient mixed-use development, and protecting environmental resources. An important consideration to think about is if we did not have the opportunity for very low density growth, such as an ADU, we'd be looking at perhaps other larger density impacts, meaning this is a neat and easy way to fit in additional small scale housing without dramatically changing character or depleting resources or clear cutting remaining forest or developing in wetlands. You're developing in already developed neighborhoods. So it's a more efficient and sustainable type of development. The infrastructure is already in place. With respect to your specific question, Councilor Winograd, if you look at the housing section, there was an acknowledgement that much of our zoning language is old. It comes back from that, largely, but not entirely, back to that vintage 1970 era thought on zoning. We've discussed as a council many times, certain areas of the zoning, parking always pops up, that we have some antiquated standards. And I think that there was an acknowledgement on TPZ when we reviewed our zoning with respect to housing and more particularly multifamily housing and single family housing. We need to reevaluate, business as usual. Perhaps there is room for change and room to strategically look at targeted improvements to be more innovative and provide for better ordinance to guide and structure future or current growth. And that's apparent in the action item that you read, Councilor Winograd. It also suggests a similar review and analysis in our other multifamily zoning districts to take that same kind of comprehensive review and look at those areas.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Mr. Winograd, anything further? All set? Oh, okay. It's your birthday, so I'll give you some leeway, but are you all set?
Yes, I'm all set.
Okay. Yeah, that's okay. Mr. Sweeney, anything? You're good. Okay. Mr. Gold. I'll go to Beth. I have you all out of order now. Anyway, Mr. Gold first.
Thank you. And going back to where I was, and I think I asked probably a slew of questions along the way. And I appreciate Matt and Todd spending the time in answering a lot of those questions. I just want to go back. You mentioned TPZ and the conversations that you had, in committee in drafting the document that's before us. Was there any, if you can talk about, was there any opposition to it, or when you talk about alternatives or other options being innovative, was anything else brought up? Was there any discussion relative to mortgages, being able to obtain a mortgage on a house that has an ADU or anything like that? All the things that affect the value of the homes in these areas as well. So I want maybe a little history from what happened prior to this document getting to us, and then maybe there were some other discussions that were had, either positive or negative, and other alternatives to ADUs in your portion of it.
Thank you, Mr. Gold. Mr. Dumais?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Through you to Councilor Gold. I just want to be clear. We're having two separate discussions. The Planning and Zoning Commission was involved heavily, obviously, as you're all aware, in the preparation of the Plan of Conservation and Development. The draft ordinance before you does not come from them. That comes from staff at the request of certain members of the council, based on conversations we've had going back now that started in 2018 and picked up more discussion earlier this summer. We had a discussion at subcommittee level in May, again in July, and then last month in September. Based on those discussions, I was asked to draft an ordinance. That ordinance has not been reviewed or discussed with TPZ up to this point. But going forward, either way, if it comes out of this meeting and moves forward to a formal ordinance, it would be discussed and reviewed with the Planning and Zoning Commission and gone through the normal referral process. Having said that, after our last meeting in September, I reported back to the Planning and Zoning Commission on the discussion we all had with accessory dwelling units. I reviewed the exact same memo that I shared with the council at the end of September with the TPZ, since they have been heavily involved in our past discussions. There is concern, I'd like to be honest and frank, by some members of the TPZ with some of the concepts of ADUs, and some of the concern, Councilor Gold, is the one that you and Councilor Williams have shared about potential impact to single-family zoning, and there is some concern on impact to property values, and also there is concern about potential impacts to, I'll call it zoning enforcement or burden on staff. So those concerns were shared by certain members of the Planning and Zoning Commission. However, the draft before you was not shared. So I just want to be clear on that. That would occur at a future date. So they have not had the opportunity to review the draft that you've all seen. Having said that, I did send it out to them earlier today and let them know that it would be a discussion point tonight, and that I'm sure we'll be discussing it with the Planning and Zoning Commission at a future meeting date. So I just want to make sure that was clear, Councilor Gold, and that you weren't conflating the POCD with this draft and their involvement with that, and not necessarily with this to this point.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Mr. Gold?
Thank you. I do understand that. Thank you. I'm sorry. Lee Gold through Mayor Cantor. Sorry. Thank you, Todd. I do understand that. I mean, the question truly, as I'm seeing all this, is finding a happy medium. And I understand the concepts of ADUs. I understand that we need a diversity of housing. I get all that. I understand that fully. But the happy medium is between an urbanization and a suburbanization, so to speak. West Hartford has a diversity of homes throughout. There are apartment complexes up and down TOD areas. We have a tremendous wealth of those types of homes, as we've pointed out. I think this concept is leaning towards a higher urbanization, a higher density, so to speak, and I feel that it's going to create a more greater burden on our services in town, and it's something that we have to be sensitive to in terms of our taxpayers in West Hartford, and make sure that it truly is warranted and desired as a whole. While I understand that we can't have a public referendum on a zoning matter, I think public hearing and public discussion in full across town needs to happen. And we can't put this in a bubble and say, here we go, this is it. I think the entire public, and I hope they're watching this, is understanding what this concept entails and whether or not it's beneficial or not to the town. Thank you.
Mayor, you're muted.
I guess I yield to...
It's me. No, Miss Kerrigan, sorry. Oh my gosh. I pressed it, it didn't go. Miss Kerrigan, sorry. I was ready to go. Are you on mute? I'm on mute. Sorry about that. Miss Kerrigan. No, Miss Kerrigan, Miss Fay. It's Miss Kerrigan's turn. Thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Madam Mayor. I kept seeing your mouth move, and I'm like, oh, is there something wrong with my phone moving around?
Sorry
And
about that.
panic. So, no, I'm happy it was you and not me. Todd, thank you for your thoughtful presentation. I have two questions. And I do think that forward thinking is always good. Diversity is good, and sort of being on the cutting edge. Families, encouraging families, focus on families. And I think that's what the ADU does. It allows aging parents who are living so long, and that's a good thing, to be able to stay in this community. And I think we want to encourage that, and also allows, the boomerang effect where children come back because they can't make it on their own, or housing is so expensive, again, to be back. And I think we do want to do what's ever possible to encourage families to stay together and help each other. So two questions. One is, Todd, you made a comment that, if an individual is going to do this, and I appreciate attention to detail with respect to what that might look like, they would have to post it. If they posted that and there was an overwhelming outcry from the neighbors against this, would that affect the approval?
Thank you, Ms. Kerrigan. Mr. Dumais.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Through you to Councilor Kerrigan. No, but it's a great question, and it's the genesis of those two provisions in the ordinance that I included. We can thank Corporation Counsel Dodge for when he sat a few years ago in your seats as a council member. Or recall that the council passed a honeybee or beekeeping ordinance at that time. There was concern by someone sitting on the screen here that we didn't have any notice provision, and it's actually worked out very well. What it does is it provides notice to the neighborhood that there's something going on. They can check with my office and ask what it is and answer questions. But if they are concerned or opposed, it doesn't provide them any remedy through a notice process, but it lets them know of the approval date. And I've communicated through the handful of honeybee permits that we've issued. We've had one person that was concerned. If they were concerned with the decision for approval in that instance, remember, I can only issue an approval if an application complies with all the standards that are required. What it says is, I tell them you can appeal my decision, since it's an administrative decision, to our zoning board of appeals. So that gives people a local appeal process. If the ZBA upholds my decision, then that appeal process goes to Superior Court. They can appeal that decision to Superior Court. But it largely provides notice and essentially outreach. And it's something that I think West Hartford does wonderfully well. We involve the community in notice of land use applications. You don't see as robust of an outreach effort in many of our other communities. I think West Hartford is particularly unique in the way that it does that. And with respect to a site plan review, this provision is somewhat new, but unique. And I think it's actually worked out quite well on the honeybee keeping ordinance. And I think it could work well as an application in this scenario as well.
Thank you, Mr. Dumaine. Ms. Kerrigan?
Thank you, through you, Madam Mayor. I'm thankful for this presentation, and I do think that we can't rely on, this is how it's always been, and one of the things that I really love about West Hartford is we do entertain a changing world, and with COVID, the workplace certainly is changing, so I'm hopeful for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kerrigan. Now, Ms. Fay.
Yes, thank you. I think we've talked about a lot of the issues, and they've been talked about by others, or concerns, I should say. So I don't want to repeat all that for sure. But I think the devil's in the details on a lot of these things. And we just need to make sure that if it goes forward, that we make sure that everything's in compliance, that we have strict rules that are adhered to, that we don't disrupt the neighborhoods, which it will to some extent. I mean, I think we have to be honest about that. It will increase the need for services, garbage, and other things, schools potentially. Who knows? But I think, enforcement and monitoring are critical, absolutely, to things like this. I have concerns, and you've heard them, and I think Mr. Gold and Mr. Williams articulated them well. So I just want to make sure that we're careful, we don't rush. I would like to have public input, whether or not it's a requirement is a different issue, but I think this is something that homeowners will have questions, and they're going to want to know some of the details that they may not get just in looking at documents and ordinances and things like that. So those would be my concerns, and it can be a slippery slope. It's funny. It was interesting to me that Glastonbury has been accepting of these. In the old days, I used to have a real estate license, and I sold a very good friend of mine a house in Glastonbury. It was a raised ranch. It was a very nice home, but it had a kitchen in the basement as well as one on the first floor. I think it was a mother-in-law kind of a suite or set up by the prior owners that had to be removed before she could purchase the home, because they didn't want more than, direct relatives, or I don't know that there was wording, but they didn't want another unit available for rent or not familial, members to be in an apartment in a single family home. So I thought that was interesting that now Glastonbury is supportive of these. So again, you gotta think about the future. I agree with that. And I think we need to be proactive, not reactive. But I think this one, with its concerns, deserves a ton of vetting. And I think I would prefer that the public has an opinion to weigh in. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Fay. Mr. Davidoff.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and through you if I have any questions. So zoning, as you all know, and I've listened quite patiently to most of everyone's comments except for you, Madam Mayor, and Councilwoman Blanks. So I can really relate this evening to how it is when I lead off and talk a lot on zoning matters. But with that said, zoning for me, I love it. So, and 21 years of either being on the zoning board or being on the council, we've addressed a variety of issues. And some of them are issues of first impression. And we could argue tonight that the ADUs is one of those things, but not really, because we've seen them in other zones sort of in different ways. When one wants to think about a office building or a business on the first floor and the people live up on the second floor, very similar. So you've got housing on a second floor of a structure that may align, beyond like Farmington Avenue or other places where we had the residential office zone. So our zoning code is transformed and been sort of a living document over all the years. And so when this idea came out, I said, okay, let's think about what's the best way to do it. And you have to really think about the concepts of zoning. What are the key concepts that you're trying to do? And one of them is it needs to be universally applied throughout all the zones that would be affected. And the ordinance as drafted right now shows it, because it's as of right in all of the zones, whether it is R6 or R20 or whatever it may be. And it doesn't impose any type of financial burden upon anybody who wishes to make application to make this change. So we hit that principle pretty well. There's also the principle that we like all of our zoning to be in harmony and in character with the neighborhood. And so how do we address that in this ordinance? And in this ordinance, it says that the materials that are going to be used are in harmony with the existing structure, and the architecture is going to be consistent. So you're not going to have this white elephant developed on a property that's adjacent to the abutter. And there's concerns as to how someone would access this particular dwelling unit and where it is and how is it set back on the property and those things. So there's a lot of zoning things that are there, and we don't compromise our building and health safety codes either to do this. So that's a good idea. And then you have to look at, everyone's talking about the economic cost. So what's the economic cost to build a structure that has a kitchen, a bathroom, and a bedroom? I don't think a contractor in West Hartford is going to be able to make this project feasible for less than $30,000 to put a kitchen, a bathroom in, and to make this whole structure. So this isn't something that we're going to see lots of people running to do tomorrow. And then it needs to also be consistent with our other zoning regulations. And this was brought up earlier about the unrelated persons, because this has to interrelate with how many unrelated people could live in a dwelling unit. So those are big concepts. And the other concept was, so should the people have to get a special use permit, or should we allow people to do this as of right? And we have a very talented town planner. We've been blessed to have one in Mr. Dumais. We had one in Ms. Limson prior to Mr. Dumais, who understand our zoning regulations frontwards, backwards, and can make these determinations. And not only would we be giving them the authority to make these determinations, striking all the criteria, but we allow them to do that in our STD applications on minor minor modifications to very large proposals that are in our STD development. So it's not a new role. We're not asking them to do something that they would feel uncomfortable with in terms of being the ultimate decision maker. And as Mr. Dumais rightfully acknowledged, that if somebody doesn't agree with his decision, they could appeal to the Zoning Board of Appeals, and then if they're not happy there, they could appeal to a Superior Court. So the question I have tonight is, with all that said, and everything here is, what's the fear? Because I'm sensing fear. Is it fear of the unknown, fear of how it's going to work? I'd like to vet that out to hear what my colleagues think about that. Because if you take a step back and you look at it, you say to yourself, as Councilwoman Kerrigan rightfully mentioned this evening, it's a whole new world right now. And COVID and pandemic has definitely changed how families are relating. And if you could have an elderly parent live on your premises, or you could have your child live on your property as well without being in your actual space, you might really, really like that right now. And there are significant financial constraints. There's so many people that are unemployed or struggling financially. So you got to look at it in a big picture here. So that's what I tried to do here, look at it in a bigger picture. So I really need to understand what is the major concern as to why people are afraid of making this change. That's the thing to me. And I think the big thing for me is that this is going to be owner occupied. And when an owner is there, things are different than when it's not owner occupied. And I think everybody knows that, because you as the owner do not want to diminish the value of your property. I really have never met anybody who's an owner that wants to diminish the value of their property. They want to enhance the value of their property. They want to make their property worth more. And what I've also noticed in my years of zoning in West Hartford is that people enjoy their neighborhoods. They enjoy the character of their neighborhoods. They enjoy their neighborhood schools. And what they want to do is be a good neighbor. So I think you're going to have dialogues with your neighbors as to what your intentions are and what this would look like. And really, I'm really finding it hard pressed to come up with reasons that don't support this. And I'd be really willing to hear them. And when you express the things that you are concerned about, check it against the ordinance as currently drafted as to whether or not your concerns are presently being met by the criteria that are in there. And lastly, I'll just end with this, that it's my understanding that at a state level, the legislature could potentially authorize ADUs statewide as a something that could happen. So, you know, we in West Hartford sit in a unique position in the sense that we are the chief executive zoning authority under our charter, but in many communities, that's not the case. And I think if you look in some of our neighboring communities, in-law apartments are pretty prevalent there as well. And some of them are much more extensive than what we would even be permitted. So I'd be interested in hearing what other people have with respect to their objections. But I think the ordinance is drafted. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll just shut up, is on the sunset provision. I think that's something that we could have or not have at all. Because if we don't like it, we can always repeal or change the ordinance at a later date. So that's it. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Davidoff. There was no question there, right? So I didn't hear one, except.
Well, no, my question was to my colleagues.
Yes, right. You didn't let me finish. Except to fellow counselors on their objection. We'll go to Ms. Blanks next.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. Councilor Carol Anderson Blanks. First off, Mr. Dumais, I just want to thank you for your presentation. It's funny because each time I hear you present or do a follow-up for questions, go back and do your research, I always learn something new. So thank you for that. So I just have a couple of questions. And the beauty of going last, through your research of the other towns, did you learn about any long-standing issues with any of the ADUs?
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Blanks. Mr. Dumais?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Todd Demay, through you to Councilor Blanks. I did not, Councilor Blanks, I didn't hear any long-staring or repetitive issues that were identified from any of those surrounding peer communities.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Ms. Blanks?
Thank you. And then I have another question. So in town, I know we have a number of homeowners that, may leave their homes, rent it out. Perhaps they have relocated for their jobs or what have you. And so I'm just curious, if a homeowner, did have an ADU and they had their family member in the ADU, but for some reason they had to leave because either they were being assigned somewhere else or perhaps they got a job to relocate out of town. How would that be enforced? And I know, I think I can speak on this. I know our neighbors, as Councilman Davidoff mentioned, are probably our best enforcers. You probably get those telephone calls. But I'm just curious, how would that be addressed?
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Blanks. Mr. Dumais, sorry about that.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Todd Demay, through you to Councilor Blanks. That would be addressed, on a complaint by complaint system. In the scenario you outlined, if the homeowner no longer occupied either unit, I think that they'd have to remove that improvement. So there would be a disincentive for them to, move away, or they'd have to sell the property. That's when we get into a more challenging field of enforcement that I think, we did hear some concern expressed. And that always is a challenge when we have owner occupancy requirements. But using that yearly affidavit, it gives us the opportunity based on that to go through and I suppose spot check or verify enforcement, and at least have a record to indicate whether or not we are aware or made aware of any change in owner occupancy.
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. Ms. Blanks?
Thank you, Mr. Dumais. No more questions, Madam Mayor. I'm all set.
Thank you. I just, do you have a feel for, or I don't know if maybe there could be some data either from Fairfield or Glastonbury on a value of an ADU? What does it cost to build? I actually Googled it and I came up with, there was nothing New England related. It was really more national. And the price range that I saw was $30,000 to $300,000. So that was pretty surprising. But, and the value of the home, according to the document that I read, went up 30%. Obviously, it's priceless for people, especially if it's grandfathered in a place where you can't have an in-law apartment or ADU or whatever, that you have one if you have a situation where you want one. So do you have a feel for that? And then my second question was the discussion of numbers and, the 1 to 2. There are so many buildings, like I'm thinking of my own basement where we don't have a grade, a wall that's grade. Do you have an idea of how many properties this would even be able to apply to? And that may be too hard a question to, whatever. I don't know if that's a good, I don't know. I'll listen to what you have to say, but I can understand that would be a hard one to quantify.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'll perhaps try to tackle that last question last. With respect to the first question, that's again where we run into a challenge of local numbers. However, several months ago, you probably have all forgotten it because it was somewhat dry reading. I provided everyone with a study prepared by the University of Texas and the Urban Land Institute. In that study, and again, it's more national, and in this instance, it was West Coast based. So it sampled 3 cities. The 2 U.S. cities were Portland and Seattle. Again, not direct comparison. But in the ADU sampled in both communities, the average cost for an ADU provided in that study was $156,000 to construct. So that's the value of construction. So certainly that is not cheap. And then they further analyzed the ADU cost in those communities to try to get a better estimate on the square foot cost for construction. So we could apply that to ranges. If we did that on a square foot cost basis, the number, if we averaged those 2 communities, was somewhere around $83.50 a square foot for ADU construction. So if we just use the ordinance that's before you as a draft as an example, Madam Mayor, your Googling is pretty accurate. On the low end of 400 square feet, that pencils out to about $33,000. Whether or not in our housing market, someone could build out a 400 square foot, accessory dwelling unit for as little as $33,000, I don't know. And at the upper range, it can go up to, as high as you want to make it, depending on the type of improvements you're installing. So at least there is some literature on the value or the cost to build these things out there. And we did review that, a couple of months ago. And, I found that number when I went back and looked at it, because I thought that question might come up, to be somewhat surprising in that, $156,000 is not inexpensive. Nor is $33,000. It's a commitment and an investment that a homeowner would make into their property, and it's not cheap. So those numbers. With respect to the eligible number of total properties in town, that's a more difficult question to answer. We'd have to do a couple of different types of analyses based on the ordinance, what lots qualify. In general, there's somewhere around 18,000, 19,000 parcels that are single family. Theoretically, they all could take advantage of this. However, some of those could be undersized. Some might not be able to meet parking standards or construct via setbacks. So I don't have a way right now of answering that question, but I can certainly dig into that if we have another discussion on this proposed ordinance.
Thank you. And what about, I know Mr. Dakers did do a statement about surrounding the impact of an ADU on neighboring communities, neighboring parcels, but not the actual parcel itself. When an assessor goes in and, obviously you take out permits, you would know that there's a bath, all of that. The impact of that would raise the property value, correct?
That's correct. I actually had a conversation with Joe earlier today on that specific topic because his memo, you are correct, Mayor, does not address that. He tried to address the adjacent property issue. So an improvement will add value to a property, assessed value, because you'd be assessed based on the construction cost. It's a harder number for him to parse out for the existing structures since they've been in place for so many years. It's harder for him to identify what percentage cost. Although if we pull the assessor's field cards for those 33 properties, we can see the value attached to each of those structures based on that assessed value. And they are in the tens of thousands or more, depending on the unique circumstances of the existing ADU unit in town. So they are considered a value that's added to the property under his assessment criteria.
Thank you. And then one more question. So for somebody that wants to have an arrangement where they are expanding their property, either for, their either a child, an adult child, a grandparent, an adult, maybe an intellectually disabled child, whatever, or even a separate, office space, COVID, whatever. Anybody could rent out a portion of their home internally without any notification or notice to anybody, correct? They could build up to the standards that are in this ordinance, the same, the same the same barrier. Actually, this might be even more restrictive. This is probably more restrictive. And what they could build as an addition to then, if it wasn't a separate ADU, a separate kitchen, maybe, but it had a bedroom and a bath, or an office and a bath, or they rented out the bedroom and the bath to somebody, that would never come before you, or, I mean, it would be permitted, but it wouldn't come before, and that could happen, right?
So, Madam Mayor, I think the question was if someone were to convert an internal space now, but not include a full kitchen, was that the question?
Not only an internal space, but maybe adding on even, they wouldn't, yeah.
That could be essentially conducted or approved anywhere, and there's not a good way to flag it if they're not showing a kitchen on the building plans that come in through the building division and referred over to the zoning office. And that's oftentimes how we end up, and communities across the country end up with illegal dwelling units, because they might add a bedroom, they might add a separate living room, a bathroom, but they don't show a kitchen, and then they build out a kitchen without anyone knowing. So this ordinance provides a vehicle and an avenue to more rigorously review that type of construction for people who are looking to pursue it the right way.
And as well as renting out a portion of your home, right? You can rent out a room in your home legally to an unrelated, and not provide, right? I mean, is that?
You could, as long as you don't run afoul of the family definition that Councilor Davidoff earlier referenced. Yes, and if you're all sharing a housekeeping facilities, meaning the kitchen and the bathrooms, yes, you could rent out up to 3 unrelated individuals.
And obviously, as Carol was talking about, that also happens where it's not owner occupied, an owner relocates, owns their home and rents it out with up to 3. So all of those things don't go through any approvals. They don't, and that can happen throughout town, anywhere. Correct.
Correct.
Right. Okay. All right. Mr. Sweeney.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm sorry I didn't have my questions before you spoke, but it was good to hear the conversation tonight. So just a couple of things. I understand and hear everyone's conversations tonight about the concerns that maybe about changes in the zoning here in town. But I think one of the things that is very apparent to me and has become apparent to me through a lot of the conversations we've had about zoning in front of us is that I think some of the zoning in the town is outdated. I think that Mr. Dumais has presented this to us a few times of changes that the town may look at in the future. I think this is one of those things that is very helpful in for us looking forward into kind of a what West Hartford may be in a couple of years. But one of the big things that I saw here is one, how this particular change, and one I also wanted to just give credit to our colleague Mr. Winograd for the work that he's done on working on this for as long as he has. I know this is a big issue that he's pushed forward and really talked through with a lot of our members here tonight. And Ben, kudos to you for the work that you've done on this, because I think you've changed a lot of people's minds on this conversation. I think you've done the work on it, and I appreciate that. But most importantly, I think what this particular zoning change does is it reflects two things. One, that our zoning here in town is outdated, and two, it doesn't reflect the healthcare system that we currently live in. One, the healthcare system that we live in is very expensive for everyone, regardless of income that you're in. If you are looking to have a family member in some sort of senior living care, that is very expensive. My family has members that went through that, and in some cases, you're asked to basically sign all of your money over to these senior living places. That is a significant investment, I think, to a point where it's questionable why people engage in those contracts. But secondly, West Hartford is known as like one of the leaders in the greater Hartford area for special needs. And we have a huge population of families that come here
and use the services here in town because we have a great special needs programming through our K-12 programming, and then immediately after as well, and then our relationship that we have with HARC as well. But what we forget about is once kids and adults leave that system, it is a very difficult process for families to deal with people that have left that process and can't take care of themselves. And both, I think, parents are left in a place where they don't have a lot of choices, where they're put into a place where, they're finding additional places for their children to live, which become grown adults at that point. And I think one of these things that we haven't really discussed here tonight, we keep looking at the elderly, right? I look at and think about the special needs community out there, and I applaud Mr. Winograd in thinking about both that community and the intellectually disabled in this process. And I really think that the town, as a town that really kind of puts its arms out for that community, the intellectually disabled and the special needs community, we need to think about how our zoning reflects that community going forward. And I applaud Mr. Winograd for really thinking forward on this, and I applaud the mayor for really pushing this forward. And I think Todd for really also looking and providing such great data today about the communities that are doing this. I mean, we constantly talk about how and compare ourselves to the communities such as Glastonbury that are doing this, and I think from most laymen would think that Glastonbury has more kind of regressive zoning than we do, and in fact, they have more progressive zoning on this particular issue. And I think that's something that we really need to think about in the long term, particularly with the huge community of both the intellectually disabled and special needs community that we have here, that we've cultivated and we've supported. And I really would urge us to continue down this path. I think, in addition to having this conversation that we're having, I think that the zoning in West Hartford as a whole, I think we've all discussed that, and we're going to see through over the next couple of years, needs to be explored. It probably was a great plan at one point, but I think it's something that we all need to look at and potentially change. But I totally understand my colleagues' questions on this going forward. But again, I'm really happy to be having this conversation. Ben, thank you again for the work that you've done on this. Todd, I appreciate you as much as Mr. Winograd has pushed this. You've been burning the midnight oil on these and the multiple different research projects you put together, and Matt as well. Thank you for that. And Gina, I see you there too. I know you've been working on this as well. So thank you for all the work that everyone's done on this. And, I'm really happy that we're having this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sweeney. Are there any other counselors that have anything else to say? Now, this will, we're not voting on anything formal, but we also the thought and the discussion was that this would be on an agenda item to set for a public hearing. So what I want everyone to do on the council is to review the ordinance, and if you have any questions, to make sure that Mr. Dumais, Mr. Hart, know what your questions are specific to the ordinance. Obviously, if you don't think this is something that should move forward, that's your prerogative, and you have every right to make that, to vote against it, but or to not support it, whatever. But as far as the ordinance goes itself, if we're drafting this ordinance, and that's what we have in front of us is this draft ordinance, we would like to have any input that anybody has in the actually content. I want to thank Mr. Winograd. Happy birthday again. I think, maybe discussing this is a birthday present to you. I don't know, but it's a really important, if this matters and is for one family, and I actually became a very strong believer in ADUs when I met a family with an intellectually disabled son, and that son is one of my son's age. And as he was going, my son went off to college, and this son was also living at home with his parents, and now he's 20, mid to late 20, he's late 20s. There's a need for everybody to have some privacy and some space, but interdependency is really, really important. And Lamb, I've seen that firsthand, and it's very real. And that family pressure is challenging. And if you have an aide with a child, that's a lot of people in your house, and a lot. It's a lot. So, like I said, for some people, this would be invaluable. And then Mr. Dumais, thank you so much. It's just, I think I said, somebody said we're rushing this through. We've been working on this. I think it was at least 2018, 17. I think we started discussions on it, and we did the inventory of housing in town. We don't have this. We don't have legally this. We have, 2 families and multifamilies, but we don't have small accessory units where people can live and be accessory to. I also have I've heard the situation of, and I was reading about this in Google too, where somebody wants to remain in the neighborhood in their home. They're older. They move to the accessory dwelling unit, and their children move into the main house. And that is also, in this COVID world, a really good model for many families. Anyway, and then if you've spent $50,000-$60,000, and your parent passes, and then you might want to rent that out to pay the rest of that mortgage off. That is a very valuable opportunity. So, with that, we're not taking a vote, but as far as the agenda items go, this will be scheduled to be on an agenda. I'm not sure exactly when, but we'll talk about that. But if you have any questions specific to the ordinance, please raise it to staff. The next item was the current budget. We are pretty late, and we let Mr. Privatera go because we are having a finance and administration meeting. Just, Mr. Hart, do you want to, I actually am the one that cancels the council meeting. We didn't have any meaningful business items, and no public hearings, no ordinances, no resolutions for this council meeting. So we are actually going to cancel this council meeting, but we are going to be setting up a finance and administration meeting sometime next week, probably a morning. There's not a lot on the agenda. It will be a current budget. It will be a current what was on the current year, and also I think we had a zoning and that's why Gina's been on long. A tax. I apologize. And I apologize for that. We kept a lot of people busy today. And anyway, Mr. Hart, do you want to sort of close on that and wish everybody good night?
Yeah, thank you, Matt Hart, Town Manager. Thank you, Mayor. I think you covered it well. We don't have much in the way of business for a regular council meeting, so instead, sometime next week, we'll schedule a Finance and Administration Committee meeting in the morning. We'll provide you with the current year projection we were expecting to review this evening, and we'll also discuss in executive session and then in public session a tax appeal settlement.
Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Winograd. Yep.
I'm sorry. As we finish, thank you for the birthday greetings. That's very nice. Thank you even more so for not singing. And on the ADU issue, thank you for all my colleagues on both sides of the table for really intelligent questions, I think, and commentary. It's a new topic, and we're all learning as we go along on a lot of this. And I'm learning, like Kara said, learn something new every time. And then just on a different note, I just want to make one quick comment. We heard about the Zoom bomb incident the other day that occurred to our colleague Mary Fay, as well as to our congressperson and apparently League of Women Voters. I didn't see it, but I certainly heard about it, and it's obviously very disturbing. And I just want to say to Mary, obviously you have all of our best wishes and joint anger, I think, at what happened. It's outrageous and shouldn't have happened. And I'm sorry that happened to you. I actually caught it on review and didn't realize what was happening, and I thought that all the participants did a great job of actually trying to, maintain normalcy after such an outrage. So I think I speak for everybody. Our thoughts are with you over what happened.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Ben. And Mary, I was going to close actually with that same comment. No, that's okay, Ben. I completely agree with you. And Mary, now you wanted to say something?
Just very briefly, thank you, Ben. That was very good. And I do feel the support from my peers around the table. I absolutely positively do. And Sherry, I actually was intending to call you today. I got crazed and didn't have time, but Matt Hart did reach out, and I really appreciate that tremendously. And it was really in the spirit of, how are you doing? And it's an unfortunate incident. And, we just don't have tolerance for that. So I appreciate your words, Ben, very much. It's just been too much. I know the synagogue had an unfortunate incident a couple of weeks ago. Congresswoman Hayes, we just have a place for hate. And thank you. And thank you for everybody for your support, because I definitely feel it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it's intolerable, and we've all been thinking about you, and it's terrible. And hopefully we can change. And just keep saying that it's intolerable. All right, so we are not going to have a formal council meeting before the election. So I see our town clerk is still with us. I want to thank her for unbelievable yeoman's job, the Herculean task that she has done and still has ahead of her. Sorry. But we are so appreciative of your professionalism and your energy, your commitment, your ethics, everything, your respect for everyone. And we're so grateful to have you. And I want to also thank the Registrar of Voters. They've been so responsive to people's questions. There's been so many concerns. And we want to have a very safe and healthy end of October of Halloween. And I will just say that many of the spread that's been coming from that we have seen has been family gatherings, largely family gatherings and friends. Please remember that going into the Halloween season, and use all the precautions that you should be using at all times. It will still spread in the same way, whether it's Halloween or not. And again, let's have a very safe election day, and be respectful and hold all of that up. Let's just hope that everybody does that. So I know we're so proud of the work that everyone does in our administration, our town clerk, and our registrars. And I know we're gonna do very well throughout this. So, and then we will see you. Obviously, we'll have another finance administration meeting, and then we'll have our council meeting will be after election. So with that, anybody else have anything to say? Okay, good night, be well, be safe. Take care. Happy birthday again, Ben.
Happy birthday, Ben.
Birthday.